What the hell is that supposed to be? Staff Sergeant Marcus Kane's voice cut through the clatter of trays in the Camp Lejeune mess hall like a blade. The 29-year-old Marine wasn't looking at the steaming child line or the endless stream of hungry Marines. His cold blue eyes were fixed on the faded, almost indistinguishable patch sewn onto the left shoulder of Harold Hank Morrison's work shirt. The patch was so worn its original design was lost to decades of washing and wear. A mere shadow of threads that resembled something military but looked more like a surplus store novelty. Kane had seen plenty of civilians trying to look military, but this was pathetic even by those standards. Harold Hank Morrison, 76 years old, continued ladling mashed potatoes without acknowledging the comment. His movements were deliberate and efficient, the way a man works when he's been doing the same job for years and takes pride in feeding Marines properly. He wore his usual faded red work shirt that had survived more wash cycles than most Marines had deployments, blue jeans with permanent food stains, and worn kitchen clogs. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his pale blue eyes held the quiet intelligence of someone who had spent a lifetime observing details others missed. Morrison had been employed at Camp Lejeune for 15 years, serving meals to generations of Marines who barely acknowledged his existence. Kane was a Force Reconnaissance Marine, part of the elite reconnaissance element of the Marine Air-Ground Task Force. His unit conducted deep reconnaissance, direct action, and special operations behind enemy lines. His uniform was immaculate, his chest adorned with ribbons reflecting multiple combat deployments and advanced training. The idea that some elderly civilian cook was wearing what looked like a faded military patch offended his professional sensibilities and his respect for earned honors. "Seriously, old man," Kane continued, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone who had never learned proper respect. "You trying to pretend you were some kind of operator back in the day? Looks like something you bought at a flea market to feel important." Several other Marines in line chuckled, enjoying their staff sergeant's wit at the old cook's expense. Corporal Rodriguez, Lance Corporal Chen, and Private Williams all shared Kane's dismissive attitude toward the mess hall staff. These weren't ordinary Marines either. They were Force Recon operators who had earned their place through exceptional service and proven courage under fire. Morrison paused in his serving, not turning around, but allowing his shoulders to straighten slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried quiet dignity that seemed out of place in the noisy confrontation. "Just something I earned a long time ago, son. Nothing that would interest a young Marine like yourself." The response only encouraged Kane's mockery. "Earned? What, for perfectly cooked Salisbury steak? Or maybe for surviving the great gravy wars of the 80s? The other Marines roared with laughter, their expensive modern gear and combat ribbons creating a stark contrast to the humble cook with his faded, unrecognizable patch. Morrison slowly began rolling up his sleeve, revealing more of the worn insignia on his shirt. Morrison turned around fully, his sleeve now rolled up, clearly displaying the faded patch. What had appeared to be crude amateur work was actually a worn but unmistakable insignia to those who knew what to look for. A globe and anchor emblem with distinctive parachute wings and a scuba bubble beneath it. The symbol was so faded, so indistinct, that only someone intimately familiar with it would recognize its true meaning. To the casual observer, it looked like generic military surplus. To a Force Recon Marine, it was sacred ground. "This insignia," Morrison said, his voice now steady and clear, cutting through the mess hall's background noise, "represents the Force Recon companies of the United States Marine Corps. Deep reconnaissance, direct action, and special operations behind enemy lines." Kane's confidence wavered slightly. He knew that patch. He wore a modern, crisp version of it on his own uniform. But this old man, this cook, wearing such a faded, ancient version? It was impossible. "Bullshit, old man. You're a cook. Force Recon Marines don't end up serving slop in a mess hall." Kane's voice carried less certainty now, but his pride wouldn't let him back down in front of his men. Morrison's eyes, previously placid, now held a glint of steel that made several younger Marines shift uncomfortably. "Son, I earned this patch in the jungles of Vietnam with 2nd Force Recon Company. We went places that didn't exist on any map, did things that never appeared in any official record, and came home to a country that couldn't acknowledge what we'd sacrificed." Morrison's mind drifted to another time, another place entirely. The North Carolina mess hall faded away, replaced by the suffocating humidity and constant danger of a Vietnamese jungle. He wasn't 76 anymore. He was 24, a sergeant with 2nd Force Recon Company, leading a 6-man team on a classified mission deep behind enemy lines. The year was 1969, and Morrison was part of the most elite reconnaissance unit in the Marine Corps, conducting missions so dangerous that casualty rates exceeded 60%. In that long-ago jungle, Morrison had been responsible for 6 Marines whose lives depended on his experience, judgment, and ability to make split-second decisions under pressure that would break ordinary men. They were operating beyond the reach of artillery support, beyond the range of immediate extraction, in territory where capture meant torture and death. Morrison remembered the weight of his M14 rifle, the constant alertness required to stay alive, and the brotherhood forged between men who trusted each other with their lives in circumstances most people couldn't imagine. Back in the mess hall, Morrison's eyes refocused on the young Marines surrounding him. "We called them walks in the woods," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying authority that made nearby Marines stop their conversations and listen. 30-day patrols in Indian country, gathering intelligence that kept a lot of Marines alive. We swam 40 miles behind enemy lines, carrying everything we needed for extended operations, with no support, no extraction guarantee, and no official recognition if we were captured or killed. Back in the mess hall, Morrison's eyes refocused on the young Marines surrounding him. "We called them walks in the woods," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying authority that made nearby Marines stop their conversations and listen. 30-day patrols in Indian country, gathering intelligence that kept a lot of Marines alive. We swam 40 miles behind enemy lines, carrying everything we needed for extended operations, with no support, no extraction guarantee, and no official recognition if we were captured or killed. Back in the mess hall, Morrison's eyes refocused on the young Marines surrounding him. "We called them walks in the woods," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying authority that made nearby Marines stop their conversations and listen. 30-day patrols in Indian country, gathering intelligence that kept a lot of Marines alive. We swam 40 miles behind enemy lines, carrying everything we needed for extended operations, with no support, no extraction guarantee, and no official recognition if we were captured or killed. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had stopped eating entirely, studying Morrison with new, intense interest. The transformation was remarkable. The elderly cook had disappeared, replaced by someone who radiated the quiet, lethal confidence of a seasoned warrior. "You want to know about this patch?" Morrison continued, tracing the faded outline with a calloused finger. "It represents men who went places that didn't exist, did things that never happened, and came home to a country that couldn't acknowledge what we'd sacrificed." Kane's voice had lost its mocking tone entirely, replaced by disbelief tinged with growing unease. "Even if that's true, Force Recon in Vietnam was 50 years ago. This is the modern Marine Corps. Your old war stories don't mean anything here." Morrison smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Modern Marine Corps? Son, half the advanced reconnaissance tactics your unit uses were developed by Force Recon teams in jungles where the enemy outnumbered us 50 to 1, and our only technology was a compass, a map, and a radio that barely worked." Corporal Williams found himself drawn into the conversation despite his better judgment. "What was your longest mission?" Morrison's eyes grew distant with memory. 47 days in the Ashaw Valley, tracking an NVA regiment. We lived off the land, avoided contact with over 2,000 enemy soldiers, and called in airstrikes that destroyed 3 ammunition dumps and a command bunker. The mess hall had gone completely quiet. Even the most arrogant Marines understood the significance of what Morrison was describing. Morrison began rolling his sleeve back down, the patch disappearing beneath the faded fabric. But you're right about one thing, son. I am just a cook now. Been serving Marines for 15 years, and I've never once mentioned my service record to anyone." Kane felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine shame. He had spent the last 10 minutes mocking a man whose combat record made his own achievements look like training exercises. The confrontation had reached what appeared to be an absolute stalemate when Private First Class Martinez made a decision that would fundamentally change everything. "Staff Sergeant," Martinez said carefully to Kane, "what if I contact Battalion, just to verify his service record?" Kane nodded grimly, thinking this would either expose Morrison as a fraud or confirm something that would make them all feel very uncomfortable. Martinez walked toward the mess hall office, but instead of calling Battalion immediately, he decided to contact Gunnery Sergeant Valdez at Regiment Headquarters first. "Gunny, this is Martinez at the chow hall," he said when Valdez answered. "We have a developing situation with one of the mess hall workers claiming to be former Force Recon. Says his name is Harold Morrison, served with 2nd Force Recon during Vietnam." There was an unusually long pause on the other end of the line, so long that Martinez wondered if the connection had been lost. When Gunnery Sergeant Valdez finally spoke again, his voice carried tension Martinez had never heard before. "Martinez, did you say Harold Morrison, 2nd Force Recon?" The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. "Sweet Mother of God," Valdez said, and Martinez could hear papers rustling frantically. "Martinez, listen to me very carefully. Do not allow anyone to lay a single hand on Harold Morrison." Before Valdez could explain further, they all heard the unmistakable sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed across the base. Heavy engines, moving fast, coming up the road toward the mess hall complex. The distinctive whine of turbocharged diesel engines pushed to their absolute limits, creating dust clouds visible through the mess hall windows. Morrison remained exactly where he had been throughout the entire confrontation, patient and dignified behind the serving counter, still wearing his stained apron over the faded patch. But something subtle in his expression had changed slightly. There was the faintest suggestion of a knowing smile. The convoy screeched to a halt outside the mess hall with the urgency of a combat response. Heavy doors slammed simultaneously, and the sound of military boots on concrete echoed through the building. Kane stood frozen as senior personnel burst through the doors with purpose and authority that made his stomach drop. Gunnery Sergeant Valdez stepped in quickly, followed by several other senior NCOs Kane didn't recognize. But everyone's attention immediately focused on the figure entering behind them. Brigadier General Thomas Miller in service dress uniform, his ribbons and insignia indicating decades of distinguished service. General Miller was 57 years old and commanded the 2nd Marine Expeditionary Force, overseeing thousands of Marines across multiple installations. His unexpected personal arrival at a routine mess hall disturbance was unprecedented, causing every Marine present to snap to rigid attention. General Miller walked directly toward Morrison, completely ignoring Kane and the other Marines as if they were invisible. When General Miller reached the serving counter, something remarkable happened. The general came to rigid attention and rendered the sharpest, most precise salute that anyone present had ever witnessed. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Morrison, United States Marine Corps Force Reconnaissance, retired," General Miller said, his voice booming across the suddenly silent mess hall with authority that made every person present freeze in place. "Sir, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps, I apologize for the inexcusable disrespect shown to you here today." Morrison slowly returned the salute from behind the serving counter, movement still precise despite his age. "General, no apology necessary. These Marines were just protecting their standards." The general held his salute for 5 full seconds before dropping his hand with military precision. Kane felt his knees go weak as reality crashed over him like a cold wave. Master Gunnery Sergeant was the highest enlisted rank in the Marine Corps, reserved for the most exceptional senior NCOs. General Miller turned to address the stunned Marines who had gathered to witness the unprecedented scene. "Marines, allow me to introduce Master Gunnery Sergeant Harold Ghostwalker Morrison. He holds the Marine Corps record for longest deep reconnaissance patrol, 23 days behind enemy lines in North Vietnam without resupply or communication. He is also a recipient of the Navy Cross, Silver Star, and 3 Purple Hearts." The mess hall remained frozen in absolute silence as the implications sank in. They had been mocking one of the most decorated Marines in Corps history. General Miller continued, his voice growing more respectful as he looked at Morrison with obvious admiration. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison's reconnaissance techniques are still taught at the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School and Force Recon training. His ability to gather intelligence and evade enemy forces for weeks at a time was unparalleled during the Vietnam conflict. The North Vietnamese placed a bounty on his head and called him the Ghost Walker because his team could move through their territory without being detected." Morrison shifted uncomfortably behind the servant counter, clearly uncomfortable with the public praise he had never sought. "General," Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the humble dignity that had characterized his entire career, "these young Marines just need to understand that every generation serves with the same courage and dedication. My war was different, but their commitment is just as real." General Miller nodded knowingly, then reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small wooden presentation box. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, this belongs to you. It was lost in the Pentagon mail system for 30 years and finally found its way to my desk last month." General Miller opened the wooden box, revealing the Navy Cross with its distinctive blue and white ribbon. "Heroes like you don't get forgotten, Master Guns. They just get temporarily misplaced by bureaucracy." Morrison looked down at the medal with emotions playing across his weathered features. "I thought that was lost decades ago, General. I figured the paperwork got buried somewhere in the system after my discharge." General Miller carefully pinned the Navy Cross to Morrison's faded red work shirt, the bronze cross looking oddly appropriate against a humble fabric. Morrison slowly rolled up his sleeve completely, revealing his Force Recon patch in its full, faded detail. General Miller smiled knowingly and began rolling up his own sleeve. As the fabric moved up his arm, another patch became visible, a newer version of the same Force Recon insignia, crisp and clear. "This patch, Marines," the general said, displaying his arm next to Morrison's, "represents membership in the most elite reconnaissance unit in the Marine Corps. I earned mine in Force Recon in 1992, carrying on traditions established by men like Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison." Staff Sergeant Kane stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper as the full weight of his disrespect became clear. "Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison, I was completely out of line. I apologize for my disrespect and failure to recognize your service and sacrifice." Morrison gave him a genuine smile that held no trace of anger or resentment. "Son, you were protecting your unit's reputation and showing pride in your service. That's exactly what a good Marine should do. Just remember that every veteran has a story, and most of us prefer to let our actions speak rather than our words." General Miller nodded approvingly. For the next week, Master Gunnery Sergeant Morrison will conduct reconnaissance fundamentals and fieldcraft training with this Force Recon company. Staff Sergeant Kane, you will assist and coordinate the training schedule. As Morrison prepared to return to his serving duties, now wearing the Navy Cross on his work shirt, Kane finally understood that true warriors often come disguised as humble servants, and that respect should be earned through character rather than demanded through rank.